Hundreds of police officers faced down a swarm of rioters in central Dublin.
Anti-immigrant protesters fought with police after a stabbing incident involving 3 young children.
And it caused Conor McGregor, arguably the most famous Irishman in the world right now, to tweet, "Ireland, we are at war." A move must be made to ensure we change. Does that mean he's going to run for office?
There is so much going on in Ireland right now, it's hard to know where to start. The government is trying to bring in a new hate crime law, which some people have described as draconian. Conor McGregor says he'll run for president if the government doesn't sort out soaring immigration. And then we have the Irish police predicting there will be more riots like the one we saw in Dublin last month. We'll be hearing from journalists and lawyers in Dublin in just a moment. But first, a quick reminder of how we got here.
This is a serious incident here in Dublin City Centre. Here's the public guardian in Melbourne. Let it go.
Extraordinary scenes, that violence in Dublin city centre. More than 400 officers responding to the situation.
This is madness.
Anti-immigrant protesters fought with police after a stabbing incident involving 3 young children.
It was horrendous, and the children screaming and the women screaming.
The sole person of interest, a man in his 40s, an Irish national only for about half that time.
Where's he originally from?
Originally from Algeria, I believe.
The knifings unleashed rising anti-immigration anger.
It lit the spark.
Their first reaction to a 5-year-old child being stabbed was to burn our city.
Burning down shops and looting is a bad reaction, but the outrage is understandable.
These things don't come out of nowhere.
The concern over migration has been very much ongoing in Ireland for a while now.
20% of citizens in Ireland were born outside Ireland. That is a huge number.
You have Irish citizens and others who are homeless on the street.
Massive housing crisis. When you couple that with, a large influx of people from other countries, you have created a tinderbox.
People off is the main reason. I'm surprised it didn't happen sooner, to be honest.
They did not do it out of any sense of patriotism, however warped. They did so because they're filled with hate.
These are scenes that we have not seen in decades.
And it caused Conor McGregor, arguably the most famous Irishman in the world right now, to tweet, "Ireland, we are at war."
He's slammed the government. He said last night, you reap what you sow.
He says, "I don't condone last night's riots. I do understand the frustrations, however, and I understand a move must be made to ensure the change that we need is ushered in."
Conor McGregor tweeted, "Ireland, your president." What?
He knows how to fight with his fists and his legs, but he also knows how to fight with his mouth.
I do not give a who the opponent is.
Being president in Ireland, you don't have a lot of power. It's not like being president of America, but the message it would send to the establishment would be just amazing.
I am the president of Ireland.
Irish politics is really anti-democratic at the moment, so it really needs an outsider.
If he does, it'll be the most entertaining.
They shouldn't have debates, they should have a weigh-in.
OK, let's bring in our first guest now. Fionnan Sheahan is one of Ireland's leading journalists, and he writes for the Irish Independent. Welcome to the programme, Fionnan. The Irish police are warning that there could be more riots like the ones we saw last month in Dublin. Is that a possibility?
They're certainly preparing for it. We were very much caught unawares in Ireland. These aren't the kind of scenes that we're used to in this country, unlike maybe other European capitals. So there's definitely a bit more investment now in both policing equipment and preparation for such events. We've had a lot of far-right anti-immigration protests over the past year or two. And on this occasion, we saw how a very serious incident, a very tragic one, where 3 children and a carer were attacked in Dublin city centre, then went from there to spiralling into a protest and then an all-out riot on the city centre streets. And it did seem to catch the police and the authorities very much unawares.
Yes, you mentioned the stabbing that happened earlier in the day, and also the fact that the mainstream media are calling the protesters far right. It's understood that the alleged attacker was of Algerian descent. Is that what made all the difference here? And is that what triggered these people to go on the streets?
Yeah, it would appear that was part of the rationale behind the protest that was called, because what you had here was basically a crime scene that the Garda Síochána and the Irish police were cordoning off and were seeking to investigate. They were then faced with the prospect of that crime scene basically being contaminated by people who were protesting at it. The protest, largely speaking, seemed to be organised by far-right agitators who were seeing this as an opportunity to protest against immigration. It then spiraled from there, though. There was a combination of factors, probably a level of inadequate policing that we've had in our cities and urban centres in particular since COVID-19, not keeping up with adequate policing resources, both in terms of numbers and equipment. And those elements then combined meant that you ended up with that scenario on what we're now calling Black Thursday.
I'm aware that politicians and most of the media in Ireland are calling the protesters, or the rioters rather, far right. But I noticed that one politician, I'm not sure if I'm saying this correctly, but Senator Lynn Ruane, she had a bit of an argument with the Justice Minister and was saying that they shouldn't be written off as all just being far right, but their individual impoverished circumstances should be taken into account. What do you think about that?
Yeah, undoubtedly there were people who were involved in the rioting, the looting, the burning of public transport that day, who have no political ideology whatsoever. They were opportunists. They saw basically a chance where they saw the city descending into lawlessness, and you know, it's very hard to identify why somebody breaking into Foot Locker and ASICS shops have got anything to do with any type of political ideology.
A final question for you on Conor McGregor. He says he'll run for president if the Irish government and the Irish establishment generally doesn't do more to protect its citizens, presumably from migrants and newly arrived immigrants. Does he have a point there? And would he have a chance?
Well, this is the point that he is making, and he's saying that he will run for president. Now, it's not an executive office, so if you wanted to influence policy like that, you wouldn't be running for a role that is largely speaking ceremonial and representative, and has absolutely nothing to do with policy formation around immigration. We have a presidential election in 2 years' time. Conor McGregor, like any other Irish citizen over a particular age, is entitled to seek a nomination to run for office. Recent polling has suggested that he wouldn't fare terribly well, but we have had people in the past couple of elections now who have come from nowhere with no particular political background, and they have performed reasonably well in presidential election campaigns.
Fionnan Sheahan, thank you so much for joining us on the Nexus today. Much appreciated. Well, as Fionnan just mentioned, he may not be polling very well, but on Conor McGregor's own Twitter account, followed by 10 million people, he's easily beating all the other potential candidates for the presidency. But then again, those are his followers, so he would, wouldn't he? OK, let's turn to Ireland's proposed new hate speech law now, which is expected to be passed quite soon. For some, it's a necessary upgrade to the law, but for others, it's deeply sinister.
It's officially called Ireland's Criminal Justice Bill on Incitement to Violence or Hatred and Hate Offences, or as some call it,
government tyranny and censorship.
It's been in the pipeline for years, but Ireland's leader is speeding things up following the riots in Dublin.
We'll modernise our laws against incitement to hatred and hatred in general, and that is more required than ever was the case before.
Ireland's Department of Justice says the bill is about protecting the most vulnerable in Irish society.
This is not new. This is the norm in many EU member states.
The bill allows for higher sentences if someone is convicted of assaulting a person based on their protected characteristics, by which they mean race, colour, nationality, religion, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, sex characteristics and disability. It appears to be well-intentioned, but critics call the bill Orwellian, deeply sinister, and a draconian attack on free speech.
It could lead potentially to situations where there are searches of people's property where there was no evidence that they were likely to cause harm to other people.
Critics say the bill attempts to criminalise hatred of protected groups, but fails to clearly define the term hatred. They warn that vagueness means the law could be abused.
Be careful what you wish for, Jonathan. You bring in a law that maybe is well intended, and actually what you do is you give government power to restrict the rights of free speech of its citizens.
While it would remain legal to possess so-called hateful material, for example on your phone or laptop, it would be illegal to share it. And here's what worries critics. The new law says it shall be presumed that the person intended to communicate the material to the public or a section of the public, which means anyone caught in possession of such material risks being found guilty even if they have not yet shared it. Some suggest this would overturn the age-old principle of being innocent until proven guilty. Or as Elon Musk put it, language being proposed as law in Ireland means this could literally happen to you for having a meme on your phone. Amusing as this gif may be to some, free speech advocates insist the new law will ultimately make Ireland a less free country. But some MPs say that's a price worth paying.
When you think about it, all law, all legislation is about the restriction of freedom. That's exactly what we're doing here.
OK, let's bring in our legal experts now, and two lawyers with quite different opinions on this subject, Grace Sullivan and Michael O'Doherty, who are both barristers based in Dublin. Welcome, both of you. Grace, as we heard in that report there, one of the Green senators, I believe, was saying that essentially all laws are about restricting freedom, and that's what we're doing here. So why are you worried?
Well, first of all, I would say that not all laws are about restricting freedoms. Some laws are about protecting freedoms, and particularly fundamental human rights protected in the text of the Irish Constitution are about protecting the rights and the freedoms of citizens from governmental overreach. And so I'm concerned about this bill because it makes use of the criminal law to restrict the freedom of speech protected under the Irish Constitution, and it does so in a manner in which the offences are not clearly, or I would say adequately, defined. So the offence of inciting hatred is not defined adequately within the bill. Section 2 purports to define hatred, but it simply states that hatred means hatred. So you can incite hatred against individuals on the grounds of protected characteristics, but what exactly does that mean? And there's broad powers given to the government under this bill, under other sections as well.
The Justice Minister has dismissed that objection, and she said, we all have an understanding of what hatred means.
Well, I suppose that's not really how the criminal law works. We don't just operate on some sort of common understanding. There's requirements that criminal law are clear, and in order for them to be applied consistently and not arbitrarily, they should be clearly drafted. And so I don't think it's sufficient just to have this ill-defined legislation, to put it into the hands of the judiciary and hope that it will satisfy the constitutional requirements of clarity and consistent application. And furthermore, individuals looking at this bill will want to know what conduct will contravene these criminal offences. So the man on the street should be able to know what conduct constitutes inciting hatred, and we cannot just rely on this common understanding.
Michael O'Doherty, is it true that the key flaw here in this proposed law is that hatred is not defined and therefore leaves the law open to being abused?
I accept that it's a fact. Yes, hatred isn't defined. I accept that is a problem for some people. It's obviously, as you said, Matthew, it's something that I think people have a common understanding as to what hatred means. I mean, for example, in defamation law, you have your right to a good name. Your right to a good name is not defined. People just have a sense of what your good name and your reputation is. And I think similarly, there has to be a common sense attitude as to what hatred is, although it is possibly unfortunate that there isn't a clear definition that the judiciary can follow. I think it's also important to state that this bill is not just about hatred. It's incitement to violence and hatred. And in that way, it does mark a departure from the previous legislation, which is 34 years old at this stage, which was only about incitement to hatred. This now expands the offence to include violence. And I think we all know what violence means without it having to be fined.
We may all know what violence means, but I think hatred, we can agree surely that there's quite a diverse understanding of that. And I'll give you an example. Now, the Minister of Foreign Affairs says that speaking against mass migration is essentially encouraging hate.
It depends what you mean about speaking against. And I can't comment what the Minister said, but I can tell you that the bill, the proposed legislation, allows for disagreements and commentary and criticism of people and of protected characteristics. And I think one of the difficulties, and this is clearly something that will only ever be teased out in actual cases which are brought before the courts, one of the difficulties is where do you cross the line from a disagreement and a criticism of something to a hatred of something. And we could argue this forever, and I think ultimately it'll only be teased out in specific examples before the courts.
Grace, the media is replete with examples of where this law could be abused. What are the worst case scenarios here?
Well, I suppose Section 10 includes the offence of preparing or possessing material which is likely to incite violence or hatred. And so this is in circumstances where under Section 15 there's extensive search powers given to authorities to enter into any place where there's reasonable cause to suspect that there's material likely to be contrary to Section 7 or Section 10, and to search persons, to search devices, to demand passwords, etc. So it's very invasive search powers on the grounds of material that hasn't even yet been communicated to the public. So I suppose that would be deeply concerning in terms of privacy and other issues like that.
Michael, is it true that after the law is passed, assuming it is passed, that you can still possess the hateful material as long as you don't share it?
The presumption about the possession of this material is if there is a reasonable assumption that it wasn't intended just for your own personal use, then the offence is engaged. So the question is, what is a reasonable assumption about personal use? I would suspect that having something in your diary or on your phone that you look at yourself is for your own personal use. Having 500 posters in your garage is not intended for personal use. I mean, those are possibly kind of very black and white examples, but I think it will be possible to tease out what is intended for personal use and what isn't.
And in various newspaper articles, it says that the Gardaí, the Irish police, will have the right to search your laptop or phone for anything that could be deemed offensive. That's quite chilling.
Again, this exists in a lot of criminal law, the right to seizure and examination, where a Gardaí have reasonable cause to believe that an offence is being committed. This is nothing new in criminal law. And again, I would stress that while it may seem a bit chilling, I think in reality it is very little, if never used, in cases like this, other than in very extreme cases. There is a meme doing the rounds, Matthew, which you may have seen on X, formerly known as Twitter, of armed riot police entering somebody's house. And Elon Musk retweeted this, suggesting that this is what might happen under the new legislation if you were found with a meme. That kind of reaction, overreaction, is frankly absurd to this legislation. The idea of armed police.
Just looking at examples in Britain, and we do see police turning up at your door if you've tweeted something which they deem offensive. I mean, Grace, it's not out of the question that you could get a knock on the door for a tweet or a meme from the police.
Well, I think the fact that many of the offences are vaguely worded is concerning, and certainly I don't think it's comfort to note that this is something that's been on the statute books that hasn't been pursued. The fact that the power is simply there and it's available to the authorities is concerning. One never knows how governments can shift or different individuals come into power, and so it's certainly concerning. And the possession of material, the fact that this can be interrogated or it can be investigated by members of the Gardaí it's obviously an extensive power. How this would play out in terms of individual tweets or memes, I'm not sure about that, but certainly there are wide-ranging powers available to the Gardaí under this proposed legislation.
Grace Sullivan and Michael O'Doherty, thank you so much for your analysis today on the Nexus. Well, let's turn our attention back to the Dublin riots now, and hundreds of people came onto the streets after a man of Algerian descent allegedly stabbed 3 children and a carer outside a school. Irish politicians and the mainstream media described the protesters as far-right. One popular Irish commentator, Keith Woods, was tweeting during the riots, and he joins us now from Galway. Welcome to the programme, Keith. Let me first of all start with this. You have something like 150,000 followers on X, but you are totally frozen out of the mainstream debate about immigration, or frankly about anything else, because you yourself are described as far-right. What do you make of that term?
Well, it's a very ambiguous term. I mean, the Justice Minister, Helen McEntee, was actually asked by a journalist to define that term this week. And she said it's people who are anti-government, anti-state, anti-women's rights, anti-immigration. So effectively, anyone that disagrees with the government, they can kind of throw under this category of far right. But I think specifically as it relates to immigration, this term is being thrown around. Now, when you hear far right or far left, you think, okay, that's someone that's way outside the mainstream, right? They're kind of outside the Overton window of acceptable discourse. But what's that based on? Because we had a poll earlier this year, a Red C poll, that showed that 75% of Irish people think that the country has taken too many migrants. So that is the majority opinion. And yet everyone that expresses that is labeled far right, as you said, and they're frozen out of the conversation. And I think that's a big part of what's contributing to a lot of the unrest right now, is that there's no way to kind of rationally express these beliefs and get a hearing in the public square.
I've heard it said, both in the mainstream media, by politicians and occasionally by fellow journalists, that the people who rioted on November the 23rd are essentially scum, they're vermin, and they were motivated by hate. Is that a fair description of them?
No, and I thought it was interesting, for a government and an establishment that typically tries to avoid this kind of class-based politics or language, that a lot of these words are being thrown around like scumbags. One government minister even floated the idea of cutting off welfare to anyone that was involved, which I've never heard a suggestion like that before. I mean, if you break the law, you suffer the consequences of breaking the law, but now we have the government saying that there'll be an extra punishment where they'll just start cutting people off from entitlements from the state. So yeah, there's a level of disdain for the people involved. It is quite a deprived area like inner city Dublin, but this is really part of the story, is people that live in inner city Dublin, that part of Dublin now, the north inner city, is 44% white Irish, right? These people have witnessed a really rapid demographic transformation. And at the same time, it's one of the most deprived areas. They don't have economic opportunities. They're living in the midst of a housing crisis. They're watching their country transform, and they look to the politicians, they look to media, they look to any wing of the establishment, and no one is discussing this. It's shut down. There's, individual kind of populist leaders on social media that will discuss this, and then they get targeted by every wing of the establishment. And so, in a sense, I hate to say, but the regime kind of made something like this inevitable. Of course, any illegal acts that were committed or riot and looting, that's terrible. But the fact is, people tried to express this peacefully for over a year. There's been protests in Dublin. Irish mothers came out with their children and said, we don't feel safe. We're concerned about this massive plantation where hundreds of young men are brought into these small working class communities with no consultation. And when you ignore that perspective, when you demonize everyone that holds what is a legitimate view that, as I said, is held by the majority of Irish people, you kind of make it inevitable that this is going to be expressed in ways other than, polite discourse. And that's a shame. But the solution is to allow people a voice on this, and we need to have, a reasonable discussion on immigration.
You mentioned that people did try to make their views known in a peaceful fashion before. Why is it, do you think, that the Irish establishment don't listen.
Well, the establishment is totally bought in on this agenda of mass migration, and really I would say transforming the country, denationalizing the country, turning it into this global economic zone. And I think they understand on some level that the Irish people don't really want that. A lot of Irish people are very patriotic. You know, I mentioned some of the opinion polls earlier, but now we have a new poll that showed that 1 in 3 Irish people would support a political party that has a hardline anti-immigration stance. So I think they're aware that if they were honest about this agenda, if they were honest about how rapid this demographic transformation is, you know, they had a 3% of the population just last year in immigrants, which if that was the US would be over 10 million people, to put it in comparison. But I think they know that the Irish people don't want this. And really the only way to get this through in a lasting way is to shut down, silence dissent, and create the illusion of consent, the illusion of a majority that's behind this. But really the opposite is the case. And, you know, it's only a matter of time until that translates into some kind of political vehicle, in my opinion.
Keith Woods, thank you for your time today. Much appreciated. Thank you at home and on your phones for watching. If you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Till next week then, goodbye.